Can you completely live off your earnings driving through Lyft and Uber? Jumping right into the video, short answer, yes. It's not a question of if you can, because the answer is you definitely can completely live off your earnings as an Uber driver and as a Lyft driver. The bigger question is, how hard is it? How hard is it really to live off your earnings? And it really comes down to three different factors. Number one, your location. Your location is the number one factor that determines how much money you can make as a driver. I've mentioned this in so many videos because it really is super important. I've gotten tons of comments from drivers in some areas saying, hey Mark, I fully live off my Uber and Lyft income and it's great. I drive when I want, flexible schedule, et cetera, et cetera. I've had other drivers hit me up saying, no, yeah, I can live off it, or I can try to per se, but I have to drive a ton just to live off it. And the biggest difference between those who make a lot of money and those who don't is their location. And it really comes down to find two big subsects of your location. The first is the overall layout and just demographic of your city. And the second is the legal aspects of your city or state. Now, looking at the first one, and this is very unfortunate, depending on where you live, the average hourly rate is just different. So for example, if you live in a place like Boston or LA or San Francisco, you're gonna make way more per hour than someone in a remote part of Ohio or Iowa, even if you both drive the exact same, even if you have the same vehicle, you have the same driving style, you're hitting the same bone, like even if everything is exactly the same, the person in, like, say, a hotspot area like LA, San Francisco, San Diego, Miami, etc., is gonna make more money than someone in like a rural area or somewhere where it doesn't make that much. It's kind of unfortunate because, let's say, if you are in a remote part of Nebraska, for example, you're just not gonna make that much money, even if you drive the exact same as someone else in another area. It's just kind of the demographics. The second big one, which I've talked about a lot, especially in the past year or two, is actually now the legal aspects of your city or your state, I think being more specific, usually statewide, and that is, are you an independent contractor or an employee? Are there other weird rules or legal things, for lack of a better word, that have been put into place for you as a driver? For example, I've mentioned this. Here in California, years ago, or leading up to, like, say, Prop 22, it was worth it to be a driver. Here in California, I think it's arguably, I'd say California, if I had to look at the meta-analysis, is the best state to be an Uber driver and Lyft driver. You have San Francisco, you have LA, you have San Diego, you have a lot of big areas. And leading up to that, it was a good place to be a driver. Now, it's even better because after Prop 22, which is a huge battle of the driver stay as independent contractors or employees, they are staying now as independent contractors. However, one clause of that, even if they stay as independent contractors, is now they get minimum hourly guarantees, which is amazing. So that means you can drive, let's say you drive for 8 hours. This would probably never happen, but let's say you drive for 8 hours and you only get one ride in 8 hours, right? Which would never happen, but let's just say, for hypothetical sake, you still get an hourly guarantee every single hour. To me, that's way more worth it now to drive. And as you can imagine, when it comes to fully living off that income, when it comes to being a rideshare driver, way easier now after Prop 22. This is a big factor that depends location to location. Some locations I've put in different policies when it comes to like saying, oh no, you're an employee now, or you have to get a TNC license, or all these different things. The legal aspects of your area, I've noticed, especially in 2023 and even leading up now to next year in 2024, I think are becoming more and more prevalent because back in the day, it was like, okay, you're a rideshare driver, whatever. And then there's a little talk of like, oh, well, should they have commercial plates? Should they need a special license? Should they need something to identify themselves? Now, if you think about it, for almost every area, you need a decal. And so I think the legal waters now of ride sharing have never been more kind of rocky or wavy. I think is probably a better word for that, using that analogy, because there's so much going on in the legal space. This varies city to city, state to state, and even now the government and the federal government seems to be getting involved. It is a tricky thing overall, but this is a big factor to determine not only if you can make a full-time income driving, because you can, but how easy or difficult it's gonna be. Number two, the driving style. Now, a big meta-analysis I've done on this channel to determine, okay, how do some drivers make so much money? And how do some drivers make so little money, even in the same area? Let's ignore the location for now, because of course, like I said, it is kind of unfortunate that, let's say if you live in, again, a remote part of Nebraska, you can't make that much money. But if you live in Los Angeles or San Francisco or San Diego or Miami or Chicago, you can make a good amount of money. What I like to do is say, okay, let's say 2 drivers live in Los Angeles. What is the big difference between a driver, and I've noticed this, who makes a good amount of money and those who don't? Like, what is the big difference if you're both in the same area? And that is the driving style, and it comes really down to 2 different things, going down to subsects, and that is when you drive and when you drive in relation to the bonuses. Now, of course, driving in the peak hours is the best time to drive. This is kind of like Uber and Lyft 101. I have talked about this, driving during the morning commutes, evening commutes, Friday and Saturday nights. That is the best time to drive. By far, you're going to make the most amount of money when it comes to a lot of other drivers. And one big thing I've talked about in other videos is when I've looked at drivers who drive full-time and have to drive 80 hours a week just to make ends meet. But I look at other drivers who drive full-time who only work 30 to 40 hours and still make a good amount of money. The people who drive 30 to 40 hours are very analytical, and I might even say like just hyper aware of the best times to drive overall. They don't drive aimlessly. They're almost like tactful of how they're like, okay, it's 6:30 in the morning. I'm gonna wait till 7 because of this surge, blah, blah, blah. They're very, very strategic of how and when they drive. The drivers who drive, like say a lot, like say 80 hours a week, for example, who live off their income, who can live off their income as a rideshare driver, they're usually just like, yeah, I turn on the app, I drive, I turn it off. The second big thing, especially when it comes to driving style, is now the bonuses. When I've looked at a lot of drivers and I've interviewed a lot of drivers, again, in the same area, the ones who make, and I did this in Denver, for example, there was a guy I was talking to, or actually a bunch of drivers, who were like, yeah, in Denver, I make about $20-25 an hour. And I'm like, okay, that makes sense. I feel like that's an average hourly income for a rideshare driver, 20 to 25. And my next question would be, well, what about the bonuses? And they're like, oh yeah, I kind of focus on the bonuses, but I kind of ignore them. I sometimes get them, but it's kind of random, almost more of a passive thing where they're doing something. They're like, oh, wow, I got a bonus. And then I talked to other rideshare drivers in the Denver area who are making 30 to 40 an hour. And I'm like, wow, that's a pretty big jump. Sometimes even double what these other drivers are making, but it's in the same area. And I noticed that all the drivers who are making 30 to 40 an hour, the number one thing they'd bring up when I'd be like, okay, I got to ask, why 30 to 40 an hour? That's a good amount. Bonus was the number one word I heard over and over again. I don't know if there's any driver I talked to that didn't use the word bonus or bonuses when it comes to making 30 to 40 an hour in Denver. I'm just using Denver as an example. And a big thing when it comes to the drivers who make a lot of money is not only are they driving in the best times, right? Like I said, morning, evening commutes, Friday, Saturday nights, peak hours, but they also really focus on the bonus structures. A lot of drivers I've talked to have quote unquote hacks of how to make the most amount from the bonuses and extract the most amount they can from these bonuses. And especially if you're looking to live off your rideshare income full time, let's be honest, would you rather drive a lot and just aimlessly and randomly not focusing on the bonuses, or drive less, focusing on the peak hours, the best times to drive and bonuses, and make more money, which is easier to live off it full time? And number 3, car logistics. Now, this one I feel like out of any of these is the least relevant, but still very important. So I do want to stress that. When it comes to car logistics, going to break it down again to 2 subsects. I didn't even realize that, but for each one of these, there's like 2 sub points I want to make. And that is 1, renting versus driving, and 2, these special Ubers and Lyfts that exist. So let's get into the renting versus driving. In case you didn't know, if you don't have a car, you can rent one through Lyft and Uber. I'd say on average, it does depend, anywhere between $200 and $300 a week to rent that vehicle. Let's average it at $250. So any single time you're renting a car, you're starting out negative $250 in the hole. If you want to live off that full-time income, you have to drive, let's say you're making $25 an hour. Let's just say that. You have to drive 10 hours in a week just to break even. Of course, anything past that is profit. But if you're trying to live off that Uber and Lyft income, it stinks that every week you're starting in the hole. Hey, even if you're trying to do it part-time and you're renting a car, which I don't think you should because you're probably not going to get that much money, but even if you're trying to do it part-time, it is a nightmare when it comes to renting a car. However, I do know people, and I've mentioned this before in other videos, who have their own vehicle but rent a car anyway because you're like, hey, I drive full-time so much, I'd rather that the depreciation, the wear and tear, those miles go on a different vehicle than my own vehicle. And I understand that perspective. So that's the first big thing when it comes to the car logistics. And I think renting a car, it's just way more difficult to be able to make a good amount of money and very easily do it full-time, just because you're always starting out in the hole no matter what. Although I will say, when it comes to the different vehicle options, I have heard of reports of people saying, yeah, I rented a Tesla and I have my own vehicle, but I'm renting a Tesla. I think here in LA, I was talking to one driver who said he rented it for $1,200 a month, so $300 a week, a little bit more on the upper end of the rental amount, but he made so much more money renting a Tesla because he got more tips and he was able to drive for these higher or more special Uber and Lyft options, which I'll talk about in a second. So that is a great example of, yeah, maybe you do have to rent. Let's say even if you have your own vehicle, maybe you're spending a good amount to rent. I mean, $1,200 a month, but he made significantly more money renting that Tesla. Where he's like, you know what? It's worth it because if I drove the same amount of time with my own car with everything factored in, I'd actually make less money, even factoring in the rental fee. Now moving, especially given that Tesla example, to the different Uber and Lyft options when it comes to car logistics, and that is the more expensive options when it comes to ordering an Uber or Lyft. I actually just did a couple videos about explaining every Uber ride and every Lyft ride, and this goes right along with that because let's say even if you have an SUV, going from doing just Ubers to Uber XL or just Lyft to Lyft XLs, you're gonna make way more money. And remember, if let's say you do have an SUV and you can do Uber or Lyft XL, that doesn't mean you can't do regular Uber Lyft. You can still do pretty much all of it. And as you can imagine, it is way easier to live off the income full time when you're doing these more expensive rides. I've talked to some drivers, like say in Vegas, who do like say the luxury options, whether it's Uber Black or Lyft Black or Uber Lux or Lyft Lux, who are like, yeah, I can sometimes make 50 or 60 an hour. And there was actually a couple studies I did read that yes, when it comes to these luxury rides, you will get less of them overall compared to normal Ubers or Lyfts. However, even with that being said, even though you're getting fewer rides, because those are paying so much, you're still gonna make way more money than a regular Uber or Lyft driver. So as you can imagine, let's say you're in, a good location, jumping back to the first point, let's say when it comes to your driving style, you're hitting those bonuses, those peak hours, but let's say when it comes to the car logistics, with two things being considered, a regular Uber or Lyft driver may have a more difficult time, even if they're doing pretty well, living off it full time, than let's say a driver with a car that can do these special options, these luxury options, even just XL options. Doing those kind of options can pay you a lot more money. And I've talked to some drivers who say, yeah, I make double the average income here just because I have a vehicle that qualifies for XL or the luxury options.